Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to ask folks to do the typical UU Zoom roll call. Please place your name, your congregation, and your state in the chat. Preferred pronouns or a land acknowledgement if you like. We do this in part to help our guests know who is in the room with them as a courtesy. Separately, I'm going to ask you to put into the chat one reason that you're joining us tonight, one motivation or grounding for your caring about these issues. I'll use myself as a model. I'm here tonight because I am a WIC baby. I grew up in subsidized housing. I am in deep relationship with plenty of immigrants, and I would not have been able to get through college without federal subsidies. So I'm deeply and profoundly concerned for the transformations that HR1 has wrought on our system of care. I'm going to ask you to remember and mind your microphone and your video. We don't have a webinar session for you tonight, not the web. It's a meeting format, but that means if you have background sound or something going on, we'll all hear it. Or if you're moving around while you're doing dishes or cooking or anything else, taking care of bodily needs, we'll all see it, and that can get a little disorienting sometimes for the speakers or for your fellow participants. So just be conscious and mind your mic and your video. You can find those controls in your Zoom interface. It's usually a stylized microphone. If you're on a phone, you may have to swipe around to find it. But Zoom's always changing the platform, so that's about as a good instruction as I can give you. I'm also going to ask you to treat each other with the same kindness you wish to receive. We can have differences of opinion without being snippy or snappy with each other. We can try to please stick to questions rather than making statements, except in the case of our guests, they can make statements. So again, use those I statements, those you, and try to avoid you or use those we statements instead of they statements. Our rules for engagement this evening are pretty clear. We're off the record and close to the press. So if you're a member of the press and you want comments from UUSJ or our guests, we direct you to the corresponding websites for appropriate contact information. And we at UUSJ do not approve of or condone independent audio video recording, copying of slides, or use of AI note-taking tools. They're prohibited without written consent by UUSJ and staff or our guests, and that's being withheld this evening. So to put it in a nutshell, nowadays with AI technology, a lot of folks are doing what's called data scraping or event scraping, and they're capturing video and people talking, and then they're using it to generate revenue independently of those individuals or organizations, and we're not agreeing to that. I guess the other thing to mention is please be kind and respect our UUSJ C3 status. We are a political organization insofar as we care about political matters and we engage in public policy matters, but we're nonpartisan. UUSJ is about the issues. We're motivated by the idea that multiple forms of oppression are intertwined and that people must work together to end them. And that's what we invite you into relationship with us to do and with great organizations like Americans for Tax Fairness. We do indeed champion our UU values of love, interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. And so we invite you to attend this evening, learn some stuff, and enjoy the session in that spirit. We'll be putting things in the chat, various signups. But with that, I think I would like to invite the Reverend Gregory Stevens to lead us in a chalice lighting and a grounding. But before he gets to doing that, I just want to share with everyone, Reverend Stevens is a former Baptist preacher, a longtime labor organizer, and an interfaith community activist who now gives or sells his labor to California Interfaith Power and Light. I know him from my work with the UU Climate Justice Coalition. That's where we first got introduced or were introduced. and I deeply appreciate his willingness to open our grounding. Um, Reverend Gregory grew up in Tampa, St. Petersburg, Florida, where his love for crawling critters and furry felines and old oak trees solidified into a political and social activism for planetary healing. Um, so he helps the Unitarian Universalists for just economic community understand the interrelationships between environment and economic uh, concerns. So with that, I give you Reverend Gregory.
Thank you all. So in our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we do light a chalice, and I have pre-lit mine. I must also say it's a pine-scented candle, so I've got to move it out from under my nose. But if you have a chalice, please light yours. My whole apartment smells like Christmas, which is wonderful. We do this in our tradition because it holds shared space. It marks this time together as sacred and reminds us that we are here together, held together in love. So as we begin tonight, let's light our chalices, but let's also take a deep breath and let yourself arrive. Let the rush of the day fall away. Feel your feet beneath you and notice all of the faces online with us. Remember, amidst all these crazy times that we are living in, we are not alone. We are part of one another's lives, part of one another's struggles, and we are part of building a more just and beautiful world together. We come from a really rich faith tradition that does not ask us to begin with all the answers question or all the questions answered, not with certainty. We begin with covenant, with relationship. We meet one another with curiosity, embracing our differences and remaining open to a truth too large for any single person to hold. We recognize that our lives are bound together in ways we might not ever fully see. And what we discover together is greater than what any of us could discover alone. One of the deepest truths of Unitarian Universalism, and more broadly in other religious and spiritual traditions all around the world, is this: we become ourselves more fully human, more alive together when we work together, when we're with each other. Every single one of us is held up by an inheritance of human labor. Workers grow the food we eat. Workers build the roads we travel. They care for us when we're young. They teach our children, prepare our meals. Workers discover the medicines that keep us alive. Workers lay the wires that bring electricity into our homes and into my laptop right now. They maintain countless systems that we depend on every day. And much of this labor is invisible to us, but it's the absolute foundation of our shared life. You see, none of us have made this world alone. And yet we live in a society that constantly tells us that we did. It tells us that our success is individual, that our wealth is all because of things that we've done, that if you have enough, you must have really worked hard. And if you don't have enough, it's really on you that you didn't try enough. Thankfully, though, our faith tradition gives us a different story. It tells us that we creatures are independent, interdependent in our relationships. Our flourishing is collective. And this is where justice becomes a spiritual question, because justice asks, what kind of world are we making possible for one another? What do we owe the child we will never meet? What do we owe the worker whose labor makes our own lives easier? What do we owe each other? If we truly believe that we are interdependent, then we cannot be indifferent to the conditions in which other people live. Collective flourishing does not happen by accident. It is something human beings build together. When we educate one another, when we care for one another, and when we create institutions that protect human dignity. And this is where our faith, our Unitarian Universalist faith, asks something difficult of us. It's not asking us, what's mine, but to the question of, what's ours and how can we cultivate it? Not because our individuality doesn't matter, but because our freedom has always been dependent upon one another. We inherit a world built by countless acts of cooperation, of sacrifice, and labor that we didn't personally arrange. Then we have the sacred responsibility to decide what kind of world we will hand forward. So tonight, as we learn together, I invite us to hold that responsibility close. Let us listen with curiosity. Let us listen with compassion for those whose labor is made invisible. And let us listen with courage, because imagining a more just world requires us to believe that the world we have inherited is not the only world that's possible. May this conversation help us remember that our flourishing is bound together, our responsibilities are shared, and the common good is something we create together. May we leave not merely informed, but called into this holy work. May we have the courage to build a world where everyone has the chance not just to survive, but to flourish. Amen and blessed be.
Thank you so much, Reverend Gregory. I really appreciated that. That was nice. That set the tone very, very nicely. Um, so this evening we're going to have a briefing by one of the smarter guys that I've encountered here in Washington, D.C., John Foti. Um, I often get to be on calls with John, and he lays it down like few others. John, I'm going to embarrass you and say I think you're up there with the Ellens, and you do it proper. You do a briefing properly. So thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, this is sort of a pre-event for the Week of Action hosted by the Covenant for Our Future, which is a multi-religious interfaith coalition that's expressly focused on making a moral call to repeal HR1. And that's a big thing. But we, as faith based actors and activists and advocates, have a special responsibility to lay out a clear and firm moral mandate to do that work because it's not going to be easy. It's going to unfold slowly over at least 2 to 3 governing cycles, and it's going to be highly contingent on dynamic factors. But if we are not making that call, then our partners in the work, especially those working in secular formats and shops, will have slightly less authority in making their case. And of course, we as faith-based advocates and activists have access to some places that they don't. And so we want to be carrying our moral claim for the full repeal of HR1 as widely and broadly and loudly as we can possibly manage, because we're not ignorant of the context. There is a major accountability moment coming up in November. And then we're going to move into a hyper session of legislative engagement that we refer to as the lame duck. And then a new governing team will come into Congress. And it is likely to see a change in who is in charge of committees. So there is an opportunity that needs to be prepared right now. So tonight, you're going to get the briefing from John. And then, if you choose to, you can linger with me and with Ursula and some of our volunteers here at UUSJ. And then we're going to make some calls to members of Congress and leave messages about this topic, expressly asking them to repeal HR1. Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce John. John Foti is the Deputy Executive Director and Legislative Director of Americans for Tax Fairness. He leads their lobbying efforts in the U.S. Congress and with the White House. His passion for tax policy comes from his own life experience as the son of a single mother and having put himself through college with the help of federal student loans. So John is similar to myself in that regard. And I also was raised mostly by a single mother. I felt that tax difference personally in my household. Foti's personal economic struggles, as well as his family of Sicilian immigrant heritage, instilled in him a deep commitment to justice and creating new opportunities for everyone to live and thrive with dignity, no matter where they come from, what we look like, or what zip code we live in. Prior to joining Americans for Tax Fairness, Foti worked for the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, where he led the union's public sector legislative work and PAC program. In that role, he contributed to the union's legislative victories, among which included historic federal funding increases for childcare, tangible student debt relief, and dedicated public servants and working people, and shaping the federal judiciary through working on confirmations of dozens of judicial nominees, including Justice Brown Jackson and Judge Nicole Berner. Foti is a graduate of American University and currently resides in Washington, D.C. And low key, he's a really smart, he's like a wicked smart dude. So let's listen closely to what he has to say. With that, I give you Foti.
Thanks so much, Pablo. It's always great to be introduced by a fellow who also got to where they are thanks to good quality public education. But I also have to just say, we at Americans for Tax Fairness, we're a coalition of 420 national organizations. Sorry, froze there for a second. All of whom are fighting for a fairer tax code. And we're very lucky to have UUSJ as one of our core coalition partners. I'm lucky I get to see Pablo a lot. And I just want to say before I dive right into the meat and potatoes of the briefing, I was very moved by Reverend Gregory's invocation, especially about joining together in community to do the type of advocacy that we're talking about doing this evening. As I mentioned, we are a coalition organization. So our strength to do our work comes from joining together in community to align ourselves, but then also speak with a uniform voice to our elected officials. So let's get into the bulk of the year after HR1 in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And as you can see here, the way we like to look at this at Americans for Tax Fairness is 1 year after OBBBA, we have thriving billionaires, corporations paying nothing in taxes, and tax cuts not living up to the hype. But the reality is that doesn't even tell the full story. We also know that a huge part of OBBBA were cuts that were made to critical programs, but also changes that were made in other federal programs, many changes that people may not even be aware of because of their delayed implementation timeline. But with that, let's go ahead and get into sort of what the Big Beautiful Bill Act was. And what we like to say at ATF is OBBBA was really a fiscal hole. It is essentially trillions of dollars of spending, of new spending, with very little to pad it on the other side. And this creates two problems. Not only are we losing critical services and programs that either help keep prices low or keep things affordable for working people, but that also means that we are mortgaging our nation's fiscal future to pay for tax cuts that are benefiting the already wealthy. Basically making public policy to help people who do not need help and who won't do anything materially good with the help the government that is giving them. So it's important to remember OBBBA is projected to cost about $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. But even that figure is a little misleading. When you actually look at the accounting of it, some of the tax policies in OBBBA were made temporary. And what that does is when you make a policy temporary, it looks on the balance sheet as if it costs less. But if you extend that policy beyond the window, as OBBBA basically is, OBBBA is essentially an extension of the first Trump tax law, you get an extra $2 trillion in added costs over that window. And that also doesn't even factor in increasing costs on the national debt, which just to say, two big stories happening just today as we're having this conversation. The national debt has crossed $40 trillion collectively, and interest rates on the U.S. government's debt are beginning to increase, meaning that it is going to get more expensive for the federal government to pay that debt, but it is also going to get very expensive for working families to be able to afford things like cars, houses, and other big ticket but critical items that require financing through the private market. And we also have to remember that those $4.5 trillion worth of tax cuts were partially paid for on the balance sheet with nearly $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, as well as additional cuts to energy credits that were helping making things like solar panels and electric vehicles more affordable for working people, and also bringing down their overall costs by switching to a more renewable energy source. And then another thing to remember is that OBBA is not economic policy on its own. There are other things the administration is doing that is having a tremendous impact, both on household budgets, household incomes, and also the prices that people are paying at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and elsewhere. And so the most notable of that is the president's tariffs. These have sort of done three difficult things that is sort of a triple whammy for our economy over the last year. The first is tariffs have increased inflation. So, when a tariff is placed on a good, that means a company will naturally increase the price of that good in order to cover the cost of the tariff. Those tariffs have been reverberating throughout the economy and have raised prices on everything from strawberries to bananas, even to things like Q-tips and other household items. Because we have to remember, so much of the things that are vital to the economy may have been created in the United States but are manufactured elsewhere. But the other important thing to remember about tariffs is even though they are raising prices on working people, they are still bringing in revenue, and that is still money that is coming into the treasury. And that is important to remember because if we want to replace the tariffs, that is going to have a significant budgetary effect on our ability to pay for other critical investments. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on when we sort of do some forecasting about what it would take to do what Pablo talked about earlier, get rid of all of this stuff and repeal it. But for the moment, let's stay on OBBA and sort of its impacts and what the law did. And so here is a little bit of an overview. This is a chart that we at Americans for Tax Fairness put together just after the law's passage. This is not everything that is in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So there was a whole host of corporate tax cuts, as well as some other provisions that are included. But here should give you an idea of some of the big ticket items. That $2 trillion at the top, the tax cuts mostly going towards the wealthy. Things like the small increase in the child tax credit. But also important to remember there were restrictions made on the child tax credit, particularly to immigrant families, as well as families with mixed status households. Again, as sort of Pablo noted earlier, not only has the administration's economic policies been painful, but the way those policies have interacted with immigrants in the administration's immigrant enforcement campaign, those have also had a detrimental impact. And you can see other things here, right? Repealing the weakening the alternative minimum tax. That is essentially a tax that was originally put in place to make sure that rich people can't just use a whole ton of deductions to lower their tax rate to effectively zero. Republicans repealed that as a part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And then there are other things. If you ask me, what is the tax cut for rich people that you hate most in the world? 199A, the pass-through loophole right at the center of that screen right there. That is the tax policy that we at ATF hate the most, but also among a lot of tax experts hate as well. And the reason for that is it allows anyone who is essentially a pass-through business or an individual business owner to deduct 20% of their qualified business income from their taxes. It turns out that roughly 53% of this provision goes to millionaires. People like Michael Bloomberg, Donald Trump, and several other very, very wealthy individuals who are millionaires, but getting a nearly 20% discount on their overall tax rate as well, too. So that is an overview of sort of the tax policies that were also in there. There were also other important things, cuts to the corporate tax rate, maintaining it at 21%, increasing corporate tax cuts such as the research and experimentation deduction, as well as some other deductions only available to some of the biggest businesses. And as we said, in total, that comes out to roughly $4.5 trillion over the 10-year budget window period. And one of the most expensive laws in our nation's history, if not the most expensive law we've ever had when taken in its totality. And here's an important figure to understand because one of the core arguments for making cuts to Medicaid and SNAP was that the tax cuts that Republicans were going to pass were going to benefit those individuals more mightily, but also that we couldn't afford to continue paying that money in Medicaid and SNAP. We needed to instead maintain these tax cuts as opposed to having these programs. And this is one of the more startling statistics that we share with folks. This is just a straight math fact. That the amount of cuts to the ACA marketplaces, both in letting the premium tax credits expire, as well as the cuts to Medicaid and the cuts to SNAP, equal a nearly amount of money we are going to be giving to households over $500,000 over the next 10 years. So that means instead of kids getting meals through the SNAP program, instead of adults getting healthcare through the ACA marketplace, instead of people who are disabled and older folks getting healthcare through Medicaid, we are instead going to be providing that money to people, to half millionaires and above, through the form of tax cuts. And that is just in the direct tax cuts as well too. That doesn't even begin to address credits, deductions, and other core things that are heavily tilted towards the wealthy as well too. And folks may have heard in the news recently a lot about what's being called a K-shaped economy. What that essentially means is that the majority of the spending and income in the economy is going to the top 10% of households, while the bottom 90% of households are dealing with shrinking incomes and higher prices. And it's important to remember that that $500,000 marker on the right side there, that is the top 10% of incomes. So when you're thinking, why is this K-shaped economy forming? Why are rich people getting so much while poor and middle income folks tend to lose? The entire reason of that is because we have a tax system that is now taking money from the bottom 90% of workers and families and sending that upward through tax cuts to the top 10% of households. And here are the types of headlines that we're seeing as a result of this. I want to say first off, I am not a hunger expert and I am not a healthcare expert. I play a pretty good one on TV, but this comes from some of our partners in our coalition who help us understand things outside the tax sector and how the economy is interacting with the tax sector as well too. And you can see from our friends at the Center on Budget here, people are losing food assistance as the reconciliation law is being implemented. What's important to remember, as I sort of mentioned this at the top, OBBBA will be implemented on a rolling basis. So we haven't actually yet to see the worst of those cost shifts to states in the SNAP program. And we are being warned by our friends at the Food Research and Action Center and others that there are many states who may end up dropping out of the SNAP program altogether. Because their states can no longer afford it based off of the policy changes that were included in OBBBA. And that's why you get headlines like the one on the right. Mom, are we okay? I have to say, again, because we don't leave who we are at the door here, I was one of those kids who grew up, not being able to touch the thermostat because, you couldn't afford the change in using oil or energy to heat the home in the winter. And so we are about to see more children experiencing things like this, wondering where their next meal is going to come. Not sure if they're going to be able to get fed when they go to school like they were prior when these programs were robustly funded. And as you can see from our friends at the Center for American Progress, in just the last year alone, millions of Americans have lost healthcare and food assistance. When you attempt to put a number on that, we're estimating that right now, roughly 10.5 million people are in the process of losing their healthcare. 3 million of those people come from from Republicans allowing the ACA premium tax credits to expire at the end of last year. Folks may remember the government shutdown last year that lasted from September through early November. That was entirely over whether or not to extend those tax credits for healthcare. And ultimately, Republicans decided not to, and a bipartisan group of senators reopened the government without a deal on that. But we're seeing the consequences not even 8 months after those tax credits lapsed. 3 million people losing healthcare cuts, that number beginning to explode. And then even more so, when you look at the cuts to Medicaid, that's where you add in roughly another 7.5 million people at risk of losing their health care over the next several years. Again, because I am not a healthcare expert, I'm not going to dive too much into this, but there are some important deadlines coming up for the implementation of those Medicaid cuts in OBBA over the next couple of years. And so that creates two things. One, that means this crisis is likely going to get worse before it gets better. B, it also means, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, that the necessity to repeal this law will only grow more as we get deeper into this crisis, and the effects of these policies become more apparent, not only to lawmakers, but to people in their communities. And ultimately, the good thing about it being 2026 and us having good economic modeling data is being able to figure out, well, what will all these policies do for the average household income? And like I said at the top, it's important to remember that OBBA is not the only economic decision the administration has made. It has started a war in Iran, which has had tremendous economic consequences, and also its tariff regime that it has put in place on many of our international partners has also had tremendous consequences. And so our friends at Yale Budget Lab, some of the smartest budget and numbers people around, basically took the consequences of those decisions and put them all together and say, okay, for each decile of income earners in the United States, what will the effect of these policies be on their household income? And as you can see here, basically the only people who are coming out better a year into the Trump administration 2.0 and after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act are people in that top 10% of income earners who are seeing their incomes go up by nearly 1.5% as a direct result of those policies. As a reminder, those are people who are making 500,000 or more annually in their income. Everyone else, so if you are not a half millionaire, you are in the bottom 90% of American income earners. And that means that at best, you're losing 0.1% of your income, and at worst, you're losing as much as 7% of your income. And think about it that way. When you look at the bottom half, actually even more, when you look at the bottom 60% of American households, that means most Americans are losing about 1% in their household income as a result of these policies. That could be because of increased cost of healthcare from losing healthcare. It could be because they lost their healthcare altogether and no longer have it. It could be as a result of a loss of SNAP and other food assistance programs, which is straining household family grocery budgets. It could be a result of gas, other grocery prices, as well as other goods and services. But in total, the only people who are turning out better as a result of this administration's poor economic policy are half millionaires and those above. And so that creates a huge problem that only further contributes to the K-shaped economy. But it also means that the people who need and spend money the most and who need those supports do not have access to it. And that is where the moments of economic contraction really begin to take place and take hold when the people who are primarily responsible for not only spending money, but also for working, begin to feel the pinch at every end. And even more so, if you wanted to put a dollar amount on all of those things that we just talked about, that means that roughly people making over $500,000 a year are getting about $8,000 through tax cuts, tax transfers, and more. Now, that is an average. So remember, someone who's making $600,000 might have close to that number amount. Someone who's making $10 million a year might actually have even more savings from the tax law as well. But everyone else, everyone under $500,000 a year is paying as little as $300 a more a month in costs, but as much as $3,000 or more a month in costs. And that is just, again, exponential costs on people who were already feeling the pinch prior to the enactment of HR1. And as I said at the top, we like to say that it is not as if this money and the money that was being spent on Medicaid and SNAP and education just went into the thin air. It is going to people and to the wealthy already. One of the more startling statistics that I could share with you this evening is that in the first year of the second Trump administration, billionaire wealth has grown from $7 trillion to $9.2 trillion. That is a 32% increase in the collective wealth of America's billionaires in the last year alone. Just to give you a little bit of a example, during the last Trump administration, the collective wealth of billionaires had only jumped from roughly $2 trillion to just over $4 trillion. So we're talking about tax cuts that are supercharged and slanted towards the wealthy. We are talking about all those new corporate tax cuts I mentioned that were included in OBBBA and the decrease in the corporate rate. Ultimately, that flows back to individuals, and these are the types of individuals we are talking about having received the biggest benefits of that. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Mark Zuckerberg, Jensen Huang, Warren Buffett, the Waltons, you name it. These are folks who have seen their incomes grow absolutely exponentially over that time period. And of course, as many folks know, for a brief period of the summer, Elon Musk was a trillionaire. He is now no longer a trillionaire. Currently, I believe he's about a 900 billionaire. So, you can wipe your tears away for him when you have a moment. But again, we're talking about people who are already exponentially wealthy, getting more wealthy at the encouragement and at the facilitation of U.S. tax policy. And here is another consequence of tax cuts. Since the first round of Trump tax cuts in 2017 and continued by OBBBA, we have seen stock buybacks by major corporations explode. So roughly $1 trillion a year going towards stock buybacks. And this is also just off of the top 100 firms in the country, right? This doesn't even go into private firms as well as some other firms as well, too. But you can even see it according to this graph. We're talking about nearly double the amount of stock buybacks last year alone from the S&P 500 companies compared to just a decade ago. And another thing just to note on stock buybacks, they were illegal prior to 1982. So this is something that Dwight Eisenhower, that Richard Nixon, that Gerald Ford, that every president prior to 1982 thought was a bad economic practice and should be banned and outlawed. And only in our recent economic and political memory have stock buybacks been something that has not only been legal, but also encouraged by both the government and the economy as well, too. In stock buybacks, it's important to remember are buying back company shares, the predominant which are owned by either executives at the company and or already wealthy investors. And so when that stock price inflates, it is not helping the average worker at the company. It is not putting money into their pocket. It is only helping those who already own the company's stock and shares. And here is a graph to illustrate one of the more egregious provisions of the tax code that OBBBA also maintains, and that is a deduction for advertising expenses, a blanket deduction for advertising expenses. And this means now, of course, for a lot of companies, the reason why you might want to incentivize advertising is a lot of companies will pour millions of dollars into research and development, develop a good product, and now they need to get the information about that product out to consumers. That is like a perfect world use of this tax provision. However, there are a lot of companies who are able to deduct their advertising expenses despite not doing or not providing technology or services that are otherwise innovative or vital. As much as I love Disney and I love Star Wars, is Walt Disney and the products and services that they provide vital? Not necessarily. However, companies like Walt Disney, Nike, Salesforce, etc., are able to deduct their advertising expenses. And this chart shows you how much money these companies saved by advertising during the Super Bowl. Netflix essentially saved $3.5 million by running ads during the Super Bowl. Same thing with Disney, and T-Mobile, General Motors, Salesforce, others, also saving millions of dollars just by running ads during the Super Bowl. So while the rest of us are getting together with our friends and likely planning a barbecue or something fun to do with friends and family, companies are planning about how they use the Super Bowl in order to reduce their overall tax liability. Again, and ultimately that means that you and I, as taxpayers, that is our money. That is our $3.5 million that Walt Disney and Netflix are now taking as a tax cut for themselves rather than that money flowing towards a program like SNAP, Medicaid, or other vital programs and services that our country has. And folks might have also heard a lot about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on car loan interest, some of these other marketing gimmicks that were included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Well, the thing I can say most about these tax cuts is they are marketing ideas in search of policy solutions. There are things that sound good, that are pitched as like, oh, that will help me. But as we always know, the devil is in the details, and how they really end up impacting people is always a different story versus what we dream up on paper. And as you can see here, the deduction for tipped income, only 2% of that deduction reaches low income workers. And most of that deduction actually goes to households making over 200K annually in income. And then the same thing could be said when you compare that to other deductions included in OBBBA as well too. The deduction for overtime also heavily tilted towards high income households, but even more so when contrasting these no tax deductions compared with other good policies like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit. We actually find that these policies help families. These policies being the no tax policies help families less than those other more successful programs like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit. And so, what's really important to remember, as Pablo sort of mentioned at top, as much as we say these things are permanent, meaning that there is no timetable in law for them to be repealed, it is still going to be massively expensive to repeal these things and undo the damage created by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. One of the things right now that we have to remember is we're only a year into this law's implementations. The effects of which we are unlikely to know for several more years. But also, to put it in perspective, in this time in 2018, none of us could have predicted that a pandemic was coming our way and what the necessary economic and political response would have been required of at that time. And so this is what we're able to project right now. But we can't predict Mother Nature. We can't predict the economy. We can make projections, but we ultimately can't say this will happen for sure. And so when we're looking at, well, okay, what if we wanted to get rid of all these things and get the things back that we've lost, right? The enhanced premium tax credits to help millions of working people afford health care. If we want to undo the cost shifts to SNAP, if we want to undo the cuts to Medicaid, as well as eliminating the Trump tariffs, well, here is where the fiscal hole comes in. It would cost nearly $600 billion annually to get all of those things back and to have those things for working people versus what we're spending now. When you do that in the budget window, because as we know, the way Congress does its budgeting is it doesn't just look at an annual basis, it looks at it over a 10-year window. That means we would need roughly $6 trillion just to get back to where we were before the One Big Beautiful Bill. That is to go back to the status quo prior to OBBBA, let alone do bigger and bolder things that many of us believe should be done to help alleviate the affordability crisis, right? And so that is a huge fiscal hole. And so, as Pablo sort of mentioned at the top, we hear a lot of people talking about we have to repeal OBBBA. We need to get rid of the SNAP cuts. And we at Americans for Tax Fairness absolutely believe those things. But that is why we are also advocating for revenue policies, because the cost of these policies are so expensive, and we also want to go beyond this bare bones agenda, that we need to raise taxes on the wealthiest individuals in this country and the wealthiest corporations in order to be able to afford to not only go back to the status quo, but to build beyond that in order to help make the economy overall more affordable. And so, as a part of that, we have proposed at Americans for Tax Fairness a minimum benchmark of raising $10 trillion of revenue over the next decade by taxing the ultra wealthy and big corporations. I know that sounds like a huge number and might even be a little scary. $10 trillion. Where did you get that from? But there was a very good math that went into this, and here it is right in front of you, as we just talked about. $6 trillion to reverse the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and tariffs. That means we get $200 billion back into the SNAP program and $1 trillion back into Medicaid in order to help low income families and middle income families. We also then believe that you should raise an additional $3 trillion and invest that in workers and families to deal with the key drivers of the affordability crisis. And when we say the key drivers of the affordability crisis, we're talking about healthcare, childcare, food assistance, energy, and housing. Those five core categories that are really squeezing household budgets, and that if the government took a responsibility in addressing, would immediately help bring down costs and stabilize costs all across the economy. And lastly, this is something that may be a little bit more controversial, but we believe absolutely vital. We believe we should take $1 trillion of new tax revenue raised over a 10-year window and use that to reduce the immediate deficit and the long-term debt in order to stabilize it over the long term. Now, normally, a lot of progressive organizations and progressive groups are not necessarily for deficit reduction. However, the reason we at ATF believe in deficit reduction and doing it on a small basis is in order to stabilize interest rates in the long-term economy as a whole, right? Buying a home right now, buying a vehicle, all those things are more expensive because government debt has gotten more expensive through higher interest rates. And so if Congress shows that it is serious and it is going to ask the wealthy among us to help pay for our long-term deficit and debt reduction, that could help stabilize long-term bond markets, bring down interest rates, and ultimately end up reducing costs on working families by making housing in the like more affordable as well. And then lastly, again, 10 trillion sounds like a crazy number. A lot of you might say, I was listening to this crazy guy, John Foti, and he was just kept throwing trillions of dollars at me. This would bring U.S. revenues in line from 17% to 20% of GDP over that 10-year period. And that is the historical benchmark for a healthy tax revenue-based economy. Just to say, back when President Clinton balanced the federal budget in 2000 and early 2001, we had roughly 20% of GDP as a share of tax revenue. I believe it was around 19.6, so just a little shy of the goal where we had, but ultimately right near that healthy benchmark for a good tax code. So all of that is to say, whenever anyone is saying to you, well, we can't just repeal OBBBA, oh, we can't just do that, you can tell them, no, we can. We just have to ask the rich and the wealthy and big corporations to pay more in taxes. And then we can not only repeal the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, get food assistance, get healthcare back to the families who need it most, lower prices by getting rid of tariffs. But we also then have trillions of dollars at our disposal to be able to invest in workers and families, things like the child tax credit, et cetera, to be able to help families in the ways that they need it most. So ultimately, this is where we are a year after OBBBA. I hope that this presentation was helpful for you all. I'm happy to take any questions that folks might have. But ultimately, I hope you walk away from here understanding that the tax cuts for the wealthy and the money that has been cut from Medicaid and SNAP, that is a deliberate policy design. We at ATF like to say it is the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in our nation's history. And as much as we say that these tax cuts are permanent on an accounting basis, we know that Congress has the power to do anything that it wants. And if it determines that it wants to repeal these policies and go a different route and raise revenue and by through higher taxes on the wealthy and corporations, that we have a policy agenda that is able to do that. And as I said at the top, we're incredibly thankful to UUSJ for being a critical coalition partner with us, not only as we drive this agenda with elected leaders on the Hill, but also as we talk about it with our communities and with the people who are being most affected by the policies of the second Trump administration. So with that, I'm happy to stop there and turn it back over to Pablo.
Thank you. Thank you, Foti. I really appreciate that presentation. You actually clarified some things I'd heard you say in other briefings quickly and didn't fully internalize. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate the fact that you've allowed us to record you, and we will circulate the recording to those of those folks who have RSVP'd for us this evening. I want to do one bit of business before we go into Q&A. So first off, um, I want you all to see my goatee here. If you would like for me to dye my goatee in a fun color from now through the election, then please donate to our 10 for 10 campaign. We're celebrating a decade of my tenure here at UUSJ. We're going to have a capstone session tomorrow night. And so if we want to see, I don't know, I don't think I'm going to do blue or red, but if we bring in those dollars, maybe I'll do a bright pink or a green or something. Then please make a donation to that. And even if you are not going to make a donation, consider joining us tomorrow where we're going to have some fun and celebrate that. So for Foti, our first question from the chat is, can you please state again the 5 areas of investment? And then I have a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is childcare, healthcare, energy, housing, and oh my God, I'm forgetting the fifth one. Uh, Healthcare, childcare, housing, energy. Oh my gosh. Oh, and food assistance. Sorry.
Thank you so much. So before we go to another question that's in the chat, I want to ask the plain question. You've laid out what we would have to do to repeal HR1, and you've telegraphed the way in which repealing is situated alongside setting up circumstance, a new equilibrium point that allows for flourishing very well in your presentation. But because you are the legislative director and the lead lobbyist for ATF, I want to ask you in nuts and bolts terms, what would this mean up on Capitol Hill? There's an expectation that the current minority will become the new majority, at least in the House. None of us are certain, but that is the way the data seems to be trending. There's a smaller prospect that we could see the Senate flip as well. But in practical terms, to do what you've laid out, you know, what does it look like? What are the committees that we have to engage? What are the kinds of conversations that when you're doing this work, you're having? Help us put some meat on the bone of what it looks like to engage to repeal HR1 and push us into a more creative space where we're talking about what needs to come next.
Great question, Pablo. First I'll say the number one thing we could be doing right now is talking to people in our community who we know or potentially think might be being impacted by OBBA and begin to ask them, can you tell us and can you help us write down in a way that makes sense how you are being impacted? And that is in many ways one of the most critical things in this moment. A lot of elected officials are dying to know how OBBA is really impacting people. And one of the things I cannot underscore enough is our media environment is incredibly fractured. It is incredibly difficult as a member of Congress to know what is the truth, what is just an advocacy group telling you what you want to hear, and then what is what is the sort of make-believe reality that may have been being constructed for us. And so finding real people who can talk about the impacts of HR1 on themselves or even people in their community, right? It is often difficult to talk about these things, right? We're asking people to be vulnerable about the most sensitive aspects of their lives, whether they could put food on the table, whether or not they could afford healthcare. And so, not everyone wants to be in a room and raise their hand and say, yes, it's me, I can't afford healthcare. And yet at the same time, that is so important for elected officials to hear. So that storyteller aspect, finding people who are willing to share their story, even if they aren't willing to have their name attached to it, share it anonymously, especially people who are from districts that all across the country, whether it's in Pennsylvania, New York, or elsewhere. And then when it comes to actually repealing the law and what that means in terms of talking to elected officials about this, the number one thing is first off leading with that is your goal and expectation. that you are ultimately seeing the impacts in your communities, you're hearing this story, and ultimately what you know is that repealing these policies and going and not just repealing them, but also reinstituting the way the system was working prior is a better alternative than leaving millions of people without health care. And that also means making the demand that they prioritize repealing HR1. We know that members of Congress love to have their own little pet projects. They come up with their own special tax credit. They come up with their own, healthcare program that they think is the best idea, and everyone else should drop what they're doing and do their thing. But what we know is that in order to try to do those good ideas, we first have to get back to the equilibrium that we were at prior to HR1. And so you can tell them if they want to see an expanded CTC or they want to see a universal healthcare program, the first step to that is repealing HR1 in any form. Whether that is, getting rid of certain things or getting rid of things in order to put new things in its place. And I think sometimes saying things plainly is the best way to get them across to members of Congress. So you might be for affordable housing or for other things. But again, I would encourage you, the first thing you should say to a member of Congress is my expectation when you have the governing opportunity to do so is that you will vote for a bill that will repeal all of the cuts in HR1 and also repeal the tax cuts for the wealthy that were included in that as well, too. And Pablo, ultimately, you asked about the committees and sort of the right people to be talking to. I will say, especially when it comes to revenue, the two committees we work with most on Capitol Hill are the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. The House Ways and Means Committee also does a little bit of healthcare, so they're also a good committee to talk to about healthcare. And the Senate Finance Committee, even better, they do taxes and healthcare. They are the only committee in the United States Senate that does taxes and healthcare. And so they touch some of the biggest things we're talking about, everything from Medicaid to Medicare to some of the to the ACA and other big critical healthcare programs. And so over the next couple of years, those committees are really going to be where our hopes and dreams either die or flourish. And that is not to be negative, but let's just be real. Many of us who were around for the Build Back Better exercise many years ago, many of us who are even following members of Congress right now, we cannot overstate the conservative tilt of even some Democrats on those committees. And so don't take for granted that a member of Congress believes in repealing HR1 right away. Some of them might secretly actually like some of the stuff that is in there. And so it's important for you to say to them, I'm not looking for you to continue this bill. I'm looking for you to get rid of it and then put something infinitely better in its place. And you should not be afraid to also suggest that to put something better in its place. I know that sounds suspiciously like some political sloganeering we heard many years ago of repeal and replace. But the good news is that thanks to great advocates like Pablo and others in our coalition, we actually have ideas to be able to replace this current policy regime with. So by leading with that, you get to you then have a member of Congress ask the best question. Okay, say I repeal this, what do I then put in its place? And if they ask that question, you know that your advocacy is heading in the right direction. But again, I can't overstate the difficulty of this. There's people losing access to food, access to healthcare. These are the people we need to both activate and energize the most, but are also the people who are losing the most and have the most to lose. And so we have to be mindful that we are putting forth tremendous vulnerability, but then we also have to remind our elected officials of that vulnerability, right? They can't just ask their constituents to talk about how they are being harmed. They then have to come up with the solutions, and it's the ones that we're talking about in order to be able to help them and reverse this trend of harm that everyone is experiencing.
Thank you so much, Foti. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I'm actually going to school them for you, and then we'll get answers and email them to folks. Unless you can quickly look at them, I guess. Percent of GDP, does that include reinstating the clean energy tax credits? And what about AI?
Yes. Current revenue as a percent of GDP means the amount of economic activity, we are taxing as a whole part of the economy. That current percentage is at roughly 17%. It is actually declining because of the administration's tariffs refunds. So that number may actually go down. And yes, the 6 trillion does including reinstating the clean energy credits. That is a part of the whole sort of repeal of all those numbers as well too. And then I saw one other question: why not share these slides? Lori, I am happy to pass these slides along to Pablo, and he can share them with everyone. I will also say, if you would like to adapt them for your own use, or you would like some help in adapting them, I'm more than happy to help folks with that. And then, what additional impact will AI have on affordability? Ooh, I do not have enough time to answer that question. I'll probably have to come back. The one thing I will say is, if we want to deal with the consequences of AI, the best way to do that is to tax corporations more, so we have revenue available to help establish the programs and services that we may need to address the consequences of the of AI as well too. So Pablo, mark me down for the next time y'all do an AI convening. I'll happily come back to that one.
This is
Absolutely.
Lori. Can I ask a question? I just want to
Yes.
explain why I put the question about AI in there, and I know we're pressed for time, so I won't take too much. But we knew when this bill came through that it was going to be a disaster, and a lot of us did our homework, but there were so many issues that Trump was, I mean, he tosses all these things up, and you can't bat every one of them down. And as you said, getting back there is going to cost a fortune. So when I think of AI, I think it's going to just complicate things so much more. And why don't we have a campaign at the same time that we're doing this to bring it under control and get some good laws on the books? Thanks.
And if you're interested in the AI issues, I encourage you to go to our website, then navigate to our YouTube page. We had a great session on the Jupiter project in New Mexico and near Texas, and we heard from Food and Water Watch about a lot of different issues pertaining to the federal circumstance. And we also heard from the organizers on the ground what it's like to live and breathe one of those AI expansion or data center expansions, hyperscale data center expansions. So with that, I want to invite Reverend Gregory Stevens to join us again and close us out. And I apologize for holding folks an extra 2 minutes.
Please, y'all join me. After all that information, what we need is a little prayer. So join me in a spirit of prayer. We give thanks for the organizers, the presenters, and all the unseen work that made this webinar possible. We're grateful for one another in the ways we Unitarian Universalists actively pursue collective liberation. We acknowledge that everything we have is built on the labor of us working people, those who grow our food, build our homes, care for our children, and keep the world running. Our labor is the foundation of all wealth, for we working people have built the world all will inherit. Yet all too often, those who do the most to create that wealth receive the least of it, while those who hold the most wealth find ways to pay the least. So we commit ourselves anew to collective flourishing over individual gain, to a society where the rich pay their fair share, to dismantling systems that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the few, and to organizing for the power to build a new system altogether, one that works for everybody. Because we know another world is possible, a world where everyone is housed, clothed, fed, and educated, because we, Unitarian Universalists, are the ones busy creating it. Let's keep it up. Let's keep this sacred work going. Amen and blessed be.
Thank you so much, Reverend Gregory. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of a transition. If we thank our guests. Thank you so much, Reverend Gregory. Thank you so much, Foti. We'll have you back if you want to be back and talk about other issues. But right now, we're going to transition into making calls on these matters.